In this video, we introduce Paul's letter to the Galatians. We have two objectives with respect to Galatians. The first is for you to be able to articulate in about a paragraph or so the historical context, the purpose or purposes, and the themes of Galatians. So between the reading on Galatians and this video here, you should be able to do this by the end of the week. And then also look at particular passages from Galatians and apply your new understanding of the different perspectives on Paul to particular passages, particularly from Galatians and Romans. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our course thesis, and we are dealing with a particular text of the New Testament. So we're honing in on one letter, namely the letter to the Galatians. And our historical context for Galatians, the first thing to note is that Galatians is not addressed to a specific city like so many of Paul's other letters. Galatia is not a city, but rather is a large geographical area. So you can see in our map here, Galatia. There's different theories about whether Paul is writing to the northern area of Galatia or the southern area of Galatia, depending on, this changes sort of the dating of Galatians based on Paul's itineraries in the book of Acts. So when he traveled through southern Galatia and when he traveled through northern Galatia is going to change when Galatians is dated. We're not going to get into the weeds of those debates. The point that we want to make here is that where Paul is addressing is whether it be northern Galatia or southern Galatia, it's a large geographical region and it's not one particular city, as is the case with letters like Romans or Philippians. And what we find in Galatians is that it is primarily directed to Gentiles. And we find this from features of the letter itself. So things like Galatians 4:8, where Paul says formerly, or some translations will have something like in your former life, when you did not know God, you did not know the Jewish God, you were enslaved to beings that by nature are not God. You were enslaved to idols or to false gods of the polytheistic Gentile religions. So this indicates that Paul is not talking to someone who is Jewish, because he would not characterize Jews in this way as not knowing God and worshiping things that are by nature not God. And then, of course, Galatians is very, very much concerned with the possibility of circumcision, that one could choose to become circumcised. And this is going to be one of the main issues that Paul is addressing in the letter. And if the possibility of circumcision is there for male members of these Galatian churches, then this means that they must not be Jews, because if they were Jews, they would, of course, already have been circumcised as part of the sort of core identity of Jewish works of the law. And in the case of Galatians, unlike Paul's letter to the Roman Christians, we have Paul addressing churches that he founded. So he has sort of a stake in these congregations, in these churches, because he started them. He knows the people there. In many cases, they were sort of converted to the Jesus movement, to Paul's movement, based on Paul's work in these places. So that they are actual congregations that Paul founded and he knew well. As far as the circumstances of Galatians, after Paul has sort of founded churches in Galatians and gone on, other teachers have come in and they proclaim a different gospel. This is Paul's own words in Galatians 1:6-7. They're teaching something different than Paul has taught. And the nature of this teaching is somewhat of a matter of debate, but it's usually said that the group that is opposing Paul, or Paul's rival group, is usually labeled the Judaizers. And for these Judaizers, based on what we find in Galatians, it seems that they really emphasize the importance of works of the law. This is a very, one of the central themes of Galatians, a phrase you're going to see over and over and over in Galatians, and especially circumcision. That circumcision is going to be this major issue in Paul's letter to the Galatians, and specifically Paul's take is going to be Gentiles should not be circumcised. Faith in or faith of Christ is enough for Gentiles to be in covenant relationship with God. They do not need to be circumcised to worship the Jewish God. So it also seems that in conjunction with this focus on the importance of the law, that Paul's rivals have this focus on the importance of works of the law, they also seem to emphasize Jesus as a teacher of the law, that Jesus' primary sort of the thing he did, what was most important, it seems to these rivals of Paul, is that Jesus taught the law in a particular way. And for Paul, he probably wouldn't deny that Jesus is a teacher of the law, but what's going to be more significant for Paul in his gospel is Jesus' death and resurrection and what God has accomplished, the apocalyptic event that has happened in Jesus' death and resurrection. And so to use Michael J. Gorman's terms here, and I want to make sure I'm giving credit where credit is due as far as ideas and vocabulary goes, the Judaizers, or Paul's rival teachers, probably understand themselves to be coming in and supplementing Paul's gospel. They came in and said, Paul has started some good things here. He's laid a foundation. He's brought some Gentiles into the worship of the Jewish God. And we want to supplement that. We want to make sure that they're doing the right stuff, that they're getting circumcised, they're fully worshiping the Jewish God in the right ways. But Paul sees their action as attempting to supplant what he has done there. And he sees their action and their teaching as in direct contradiction and sort of incompatible with Paul's own teaching. And that really comes out in the letter of Galatians and in the tone of Galatians that we'll talk about in just a moment here. So with respect to purposes and themes of Galatians, Paul is going to represent his gospel. He's going to again state what his gospel is, what some of the underpinnings of it are, and what its results should be for the Galatian Christians. And at the same time, he's going to counter his rivals' false gospel, that he's going to sort of try and take away the underpinnings or the foundational beliefs of his rivals' so-called gospel. And he's going to do this on the basis of justification and a couple other concepts that we'll look at in just a second here. So Galatians 2:15-16, it's short. I'm going to read it for us. We ourselves are Jews by birth. Namely, Paul is saying, I'm a Jew by birth and not a Gentile sinner. Yet we know that a person is justified not by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And we have come to believe in Christ Jesus so that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by doing works of the law, because no one will be justified by works of the law. So here Paul is really laying out this contrast about works of the law on the one hand and faith in Christ on the other, for the situation in Galatia. And so this is where we get some of this bit about the different perspectives on Paul. So for those who take a radical new perspective, they're going to say, well, Paul's only addressing Gentiles here. He's not making this contrast for Jews and for Gentiles. He's making this contrast between works of the law and faith in Christ for Gentiles only. Whatever the case might be, whatever one's perspective might be, whether this is relevant for Jews and Gentiles or just Gentiles, what Paul does in Galatians is present justification by faith in Christ as the way that Gentiles get into relationship and are able to worship the Jewish God. And then again, this key word, this key phrase, law and works of the law, is going to come up several times in Galatians. It's going to be one of those main themes. And one of the places where we sort of have a sticky point in Galatians with respect to the law or works of the law is Galatians chapter 3, verses 19-26. And so what I want you to do before I turn to this passage and make some comments about it, I want you to turn to this passage, read it, and in the course notes, write down what you think Paul is doing with respect to the law here. Is he presenting the law as a positive thing or a negative thing? And why do you think the way you think about this? So this should probably be about 3 sentences to a paragraph in length here. So now that you've done this lecture pause, here are some of the things that Paul says in Galatians chapter 3 about the law. And my take is that these don't sound like positive things, that whether for rhetorical purposes or whether because they are truly his theological underpinnings, Paul doesn't present the law in the most positive light in Galatians chapter 3. He presents it more positively elsewhere in his letters, but there's a sort of shadow cast over the law here. Paul says that the law was added because of transgressions, that it was sort of an afterthought, that only after transgressions came in did the law come in as a way to sort of tamp down those transgressions. He says it was ordained through angels by a mediator. So the law doesn't even come straight from God, according to Galatians 3. It has to be ordained. It has to come through angels and through a mediator. So it's a few steps removed from God's self. Then Paul is also going to say that before Christ we were imprisoned under the law, so that the law is a prison. The law is also called a disciplinarian in Galatians chapter 3. So you'll see this term translated different ways. You might see it translated pedagogue or servant or something like this. And there is debate about this particular term and how Paul's using it in Galatians 3. I tend to think it as a more negative term, that a disciplinarian, or this term, pedagogos, is one who's in charge of a child until that child is brought up and educated to a certain age and sort of left to their own devices or left to the care of their parents. Disciplinarians weren't necessarily positively viewed by those who were under a disciplinarian, sort of like the mean babysitter or something like this. And then Paul says that now that faith has come in, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian, so that the disciplinarian or the law is sort of no longer necessary. So all of this is to say that Paul sort of has a negative tinge to the law in Galatians chapter 3. And the reason for that very well might be because he really wants to contrast what his rivals are saying about the law and their emphasis on works of the law in their own teaching. And in contrast, Paul is going to emphasize freedom in Christ. So I'm not going to read out Galatians 4, 1 through 7 here. It's a little bit longer. I invite you to go ahead and pause and read it. And then note here that Paul says that we're no longer enslaved by the elemental spirits nor the law, that freedom in Christ has given us this sort of absolute new reality, that there is this new time where the heir has grown up and the slave has become a grown heir, that there's this new status that has been given because of freedom in Christ. Paul's also going to very strongly, in very harsh words, address circumcision and his rivals' position on circumcision. So Paul's letter to the Galatians is usually characterized as Paul's angry letter, and rightly so. He says things like, "You stupid Galatians," or "I wish that these teachers would emasculate themselves or castrate themselves." But we also see it with respect to the structure of Paul's opening to the letter of Galatians. Remember when we talked about Philemon, we talked about the different elements of ancient letters and how letter writing was its own genre. It had these sort of stock elements, that Philemon had a salutation with those addressed with a greeting, and then a thanksgiving that starts at the purple highlighting there, a thanksgiving of about a sentence or two before jumping into the body. And this is the case with all of Paul's other letters as well, as he has a thanksgiving. He gives thanks for the congregations or the individuals to whom he is writing. This is not the case in Galatians. So you see here we have our salutations, our greeting with grace to you and peace from God our Father. Continuing on, and then he moves straight into the body with the phrase, "I am astonished." He sort of jumps right in to the meat of the issue with a negative critique about what is going on in the congregations in Galatia. So there is no thanksgiving. And what this suggests is that Paul has intentionally removed the thanksgiving, perhaps because he's not thankful for the Galatians, or perhaps, and more likely, because he knows they will notice the missing thanksgiving, that he is not in the letter noting his thanks to God for them, or is not praying to God in the letter for them, and that they'll notice this and they'll sort of pick up that this is an aspect of Paul's anger, and then he jumps right into this phrase, I am astonished. So this lack of thanksgiving is another hint that Paul is quite upset, quite angry in Galatians because of the issue of circumcision, the issue that some Galatian Christians who were not ethnically Jewish are either thinking about becoming circumcised because they think that will allow them to properly worship the Jewish God, or have already had themselves circumcised, have already undergone surgery, become circumcised because they think it necessary to worship the Jewish God. Paul says that's absolutely counter to my gospel. What matters is the faith of Jesus and faith in Jesus, which has set you free to worship the Jewish God. And so with Paul's anger and with the addressing of his the issue of circumcision, just like Philemon, we don't have any clear evidence of what Philemon did with Onesimus, whether he set him free, whether he accepted him back, what happened there. We don't know. History doesn't necessarily tell us. The same is true with Galatians. We're sort of left hanging with respect to how the Galatians received this letter, whether they sort of got back on Paul's gospel train or they continued on the rival gospel train. We don't have a lot of evidence for the Galatians' response to Paul's letter to them.